Joshua chapter 2. We've got spies behind enemy lines. We've got a prostitute. We've got a king who uncovered those spies and is giving chase. All the ingredients for a great story. Let's check it out. Following chapter 1, where God encouraged Joshua to be strong and courageous, now we read in chapter 2, and Joshua, the son of Nun, sent 2 men out of Shittim to spy secretly, saying, "Go see the land and Jericho." So the first action that Joshua takes now is to send spies. There are those who would critique Joshua for doing this. God just encouraged him to be strong and courageous, said he would be with him. What does Joshua do? Send spies? Where's the faith? Some see this act of sending spies as a lack of faith, timidness. I would disagree, though. The fact that God promises to be with Joshua doesn't exempt him from taking normal action, normal human action. You can't count on miracles. And Joshua knows, he's been informed by God that they're about to cross the Jordan and begin conquering the land. What do you have to do before you begin a military conquest? You've got to gather intelligence. And that's exactly what Joshua is doing. So sending spies is a natural act. But there's another question. Joshua obviously is following his teacher's footsteps, Moses, because that's what Moses did in preparation for entering the land. But of course, that raises a question, because the sending of spies by Moses actually led to tragedy. It is because of those spies that the people did not believe in their capacity to conquer the land, and hence were punished. That generation would not enter the land and basically had to dwell in the desert for 40 years. So did Joshua not learn anything? He's just repeating that failure of Moses? Well, in order to really answer that question, we have to compare the two. And the information we just read in the beginning of verse 1 already reveals that there are dramatic changes. For if we compare Moses' sending of spies, which appears in the book of Numbers, to that of Joshua, we can see great differences. Moses sent the spies. This is in Numbers chapter 13. The Lord spoke to Moses saying, "Send out for yourself men who will scout the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the children of Israel. You shall send 1 man each for his father's tribe. Each one shall be a chieftain in their midst." So Moses sent them from the desert of Paran by the word of the Lord. All of them were men of distinction. They were the heads of the children of Israel. And then there's a list of all the names, 12 spies that were sent, including, of course, Caleb and Joshua, Caleb and Yehoshua. Moses sent them to scout the land of Canaan, and he said to them, "Go up this way in the south and climb up the mountain," etc., giving them mission. "You shall see what kind of land it is and the people who inhabit it. Are they strong or weak? Are they few or many? And what of the land they inhabit? Is it good or bad? And what of the cities in which they reside? Are they in camps or in fortresses? What is the soil like? Is it fat or lean? Are there any trees in it or not? You shall be courageous and take from the fruit of the land." And that's exactly what they did. They went up and explored the land, and eventually they came back returning. They returned from scouting the land at the end of 40 days. They went and they came to Moses and Aaron and all the congregation of the children of Israel in the desert of Paran to Kadesh. They brought them back a report, as well as the entire congregation, and they showed them the fruit of the land. They told them and said, "We came to the land to which you sent us, and it is flowing with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who inhabit the land are mighty, and the cities are extremely huge and fortified. And there we saw even the offspring of the giant." And then they scared the people, the Amalekites and all the different nations in the area. And the people are totally dismayed. The spies continued saying, "We are unable to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." They spread an evil report about the land which they had scouted, telling the children of Israel, "The land we passed through to explore is a land that consumes its inhabitants. and all the people we saw in it are men of stature. And the people indeed responded with tremendous fear, saying that they don't think they can conquer the land, and they wanted to even return to Egypt. And hence, we're totally surprised seeing that Joshua follows suit and does the exact same thing. However, if we compare the sending of spies by Joshua to that of Moses, we note certain differences. Let's look at this chart. Right, we know the number of spies that Moses sent were 12, and they were princes of the tribes, chieftains. And their goal was to gather both military intelligence as well as information about the land itself. And it was all done publicly, and they were supposed to report back to the people in addition to Moses. However, when we go back to our verse about Joshua, we note first that Joshua sent 2 spies. And by the way, in the simple reading of the text, there are no names. We don't even know who they are. Obviously not famous people, according to the simple reading of the Pshat. The sages, I tried to identify these people and gave them, famous names. But on the simple reading, there are no names with no influence, and they are supposed to report, about the direct information necessary for the attack of Jericho. And it was all done secretly, quietly, right? And as we see at the end of the chapter, they reported back only to Joshua. In other words, it seems that Joshua did learn the lesson. He didn't want to take any risks. He didn't want to send spies who were men of stature who could have an influence upon the people. And then they only sent 2, and they had a limited mission regarding Jericho, not how to appreciate the land in general. And it was all done quietly with a direct report back to Moses himself. So it seems like, on the one hand, Joshua follows suits and sends spies just as Moses did, but he learned the lessons and therefore did it in a manner that did not entail risks. So Joshua sends the spies. What's interesting beyond the actual dispatch of the spies is also the location from which the spies were sent. Because if we go back to our text, we'll note that the location mentioned is out of Shittim. Right? The place of Shittim is a place that we're familiar with. It's found on the plains of Moab, east of the Jordan. We don't know exactly. There's different ideas about where it's situated. Obviously, not too far from the Jordan River on the east. Interestingly enough, that location is mentioned previously in the Torah as well. And I am referring to another famous story found in the book of Numbers. That is the story of the sin of the people with Baal Peor. Let's take a look at Numbers 25. And Israel abode in Shittim, and all the people began to commit harlotry with the daughters of Moab. And they called the people to their sacrifices of their gods, and the people did eat and bowed down to their gods. And Israel joined himself to Baal Peor, that's the name of their god, and the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel. So we have here a terrible sin performed by the people in Shittim, in that very place. And what was the nature of that sin? Interestingly enough, it involved harlotry, right? They had relations with the daughters of Moab, and that led also to idolatry. It's very interesting because here too, we'll see a story that mentions Shittim. However, in this instance, we're going to have a slightly different outcome, but let's see what happens. So they get their mission and they depart, and they went from Shittim secretly and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab, in English, Rahab, and they lay there, right? So we already raised some question marks. What kind of people did Joshua send, right? Where are they going? To the harlot's house, right? Prostitute's house, Rahab. And notice the language as well, right? Vayavo, and they came, the verb lavo can carry sexual connotation, and definitely the continuation, Vayishkevu shama, and they lay there, moves in that similar direction. And so we are with that combination of the mention of shittim and a prostitute, a harlot, and also all these verbs, they came and they lay, all carrying sexual connotations. We're raising some question marks about the nature of these spies and exactly what are they doing there in Jericho. We continue reading, and it was told to the king of Jericho, saying, behold, men have come here this night from the children of Israel to search the land. So they're uncovered. These spies didn't do such a good job of staying undercover. The king knows of their entering and infiltrating the city of Jericho, and he knows their identity. And the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, bring forth the men who have come to you. That was the verb again, come to you, haba'im elayich, that have entered your house. For they have come to search out the entire land. They've come to, literally, the verb used here, lachfol, is to dig. They've come to dig out the land. In other words, to gather information about the land. So Rahab now is in dire straits because the king is onto the fact that there are spies in her house. And of course, it puts her in a very dangerous situation. You can't blame her. I mean, she didn't know necessarily. And of course, she didn't invite them. They came to her house. Why did the spies come to Rahab's house, to the prostitute's house? Well, if we don't want to take it in a negative light and give the benefit of the doubt, well, in ancient times, they didn't have like Howard Johnson's hotel chain, right? But who kept the hotels, the inns? Oftentimes, the inns were also brothels where you could sleep, or you could sleep with somebody. That was the nature. So it might be logical because these spies have to remain undercover, and therefore they figured out that the best place to be is in the hotel, right? Rahab's home, and hence that's why they decided to stay there. They probably also thought they could gather information about the city in a place where a lot of people go in and out. So I think we can say maybe they had positive intention, but nevertheless, they were discovered, and now the king is demanding that Rahab hand them over. What will Rahab do? So what would we expect her to do? Her life's in danger, obviously. The king is onto her, and the fact that she's now hosting spies. She can come out clean, saying she didn't know they were spies and just hand them over. Let's see what she does. Now the woman had taken the two men and had hidden them. Notice in the translation, it's given in the pluperfect, past perfect. It was already done earlier. It doesn't necessarily have to be translated in such a way, but it makes sense. Maybe she heard commotion, she heard soldiers coming her way, so maybe she preempted. Anyway, she had taken the two men and hidden them. And she said, now, after we're informed that she hid the two men, she speaks to the soldiers. And what does she say? Indeed, the men came to me. Ba'u elai. Notice again that verb, which, like we said, carries sexual connotation, and maybe the soldiers would understand knowing who she was. But I did not know from where they were. Lo yadati, right? I did not know. I didn't know they were spies. And it was time to close the gate, and it was night, at darkness, that the men went out. I do not know where they went. Again, professing not knowing. Pursue after them quickly, for you will overtake them. Now she directs them, and notice how she emphasizes, pursue after them quickly, maher, right? She directs these soldiers, don't waste time. In other words, don't start searching. You've got to quickly dispatch yourselves and try to catch up. You'll be able to overtake them. So she very shrewdly, even though maybe very dangerously, puts her life on the line for some reason or another, and doesn't hand over those two guest spies, but rather covers up for them, hiding them, and then convinces the soldiers to go give chase, right? So she was placed in a situation where the king sent a message, right, with his soldiers, demanding that she take out the guests, Hotzi hanashim habayim elaich, right, bring them out. Of course, that's reminiscent of, let's say, what happened in Sdom, where the angels who visited Lot and stayed by him, and then, as in response, the people of Sdom demanded from Lot to bring out Hotzi hanashim shabau elecha halayla, Siem Elenu, bring them out, right, to us. So we're in a similar situation here as far as Rahab is concerned, but she doesn't. She's not willing to hand over the guests in a dangerous situation over to the king, but she puts herself on the line, lying to the king and hiding the spies in her house. So she was pretty smart in at least covering up, pretending she doesn't know, feigning innocence, and then also directing the soldiers to leave quickly in order to overtake them. Then we're informed, and she had brought them up to the roof, and she hid them with the stalks of flax. Literally, vatitmenem bepishtaetz. She kind of, litmon is to dig up, to bury. She buried them in the flax, right? In all the materials used there, I guess, for making garments or other produce, right? She basically buried them in the pile of flax that she had laid arranged upon the roof. Notice there's kind of an irony here, because she buried them, right? If we recall, the spies were meant to do what? They were meant to dig up the land. They were meant themselves to dig up, uncover the land, but they're the ones who are being buried here on the rooftop of Rahav's home. Okay, so she hid them. And the men pursued them, namely the soldiers pursued them in the direction of the Jordan to the fords. And as soon as the pursuers had gone, which seems to give us a relief, because the spies are no longer in danger, but we're later informed, as the pursuers had gone out, they shut the gate. So that basically locks the spies in the city. They probably locked the gate to prevent any surprise attack. In any event, that leaves the spies apparently without a possibility of escaping. And before they were asleep, she came on them upon the roof. Other terminology which is reminiscent of the story of Sodom in Genesis 19, terem mishkavu, before they went to sleep. They were surrounded by the people of Sodom. So in this instance, before they went to sleep, right, Rahab goes up upon the roof. And she said to the men, now we're trying to figure out what's behind this surprising behavior of Rahab. Why should she risk her life? And now we hear her words. And she said to the men, I know, right? This is before she professed not knowing. Well, now she knows something. I know that the Lord has given you the land. Which is very interesting and dramatic. In other words, she is a resident of the land, Canaan, basically professes and acknowledges that this land will be given by the Lord to them, to the Israelites. I know that the Lord has given you the land, and that your terror is fallen upon us. and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites that were on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you completely destroyed. Now, how does she know about all this? We're informed that she has information about two dramatic events, the splitting of the Red Sea and also the conquest of the kingdoms to the east, right? The two powerful kingdoms of Sihon and Og. So, of course, not surprisingly, the information of what happened to their neighbors in the east reached Jericho, and apparently even what happened in Egypt reached Jericho. So she heard about these events, and as soon as we heard, our hearts melted. Notice that terminology, our hearts melted, nor did there remain any more spirit in any man because of you. So now she testifies to the situation, the morale of the people. Their hearts melted and nobody had any spirit. Everybody was totally dismayed and lacking hope. I want to just focus for a second on that term, our hearts melted, right? Because we're familiar with that term from somewhere else. Namely, if you recall, that was exactly the response of the Israelites after they heard the report of the spies. This is reported in Deuteronomy, in the first chapter, where there's a recap of the history. Deuteronomy chapter 1 and verse 28. After we have the account of the spies that took from the fruit of the land, but then dismayed, the land is good, yet we would not go up, but rebelled against the commandment of the Lord your God. And you murmured in your tents and said, because the Lord hated us, he has brought us forth out of the land of Egypt to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites, to destroy us. Where are we going? Our brothers, namely the other spies, have made our hearts to melt, saying the people is greater and taller than we, and the cities are great and fortified up to heaven. Notice, very ironically, the reaction of the people of Israel to the original spies of Moses was that their hearts melted. And what's ironic and tragic is that whose hearts actually melted? The dwellers of the land, when they heard what happened in Egypt and later on in the east of the Jordan. And so instead of appreciating that situation and having confidence, it's the Israelites whose hearts melted, right? So we can see here kind of an irony in that comparable description of the situation, where now the peoples of Jericho and perhaps the whole land of Canaan, their hearts melted, as did the Israelites many years beforehand in a response to the spies' report. So Rahab is now telling the spies what she heard, and she knows that the land will be given to the Israelites. And then she continues on saying, and this is perhaps the most important statement here, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So now she makes a profession of faith. And notice she even uses the name, right? The tetragrammaton, the holy name of Hashem, for like the personal name of Hashem, for the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So usually that personal name of God is only used by Israelites here. Rahab uses it as if professing belief in that specific God of Israel, Hashem, right? The Lord. Furthermore, she describes him as the God in heaven and on the earth below. And this is of great theological importance. For you know that in ancient times in idolatry, the belief was one that there were different gods over different domains. So there was the god of the sky, the god of the sea, the god of the wind, the god of war, the god of rain. Everyone had his own domain. And now, when she professes her belief in the God of Israel, she describes him as being the God in heaven above and on earth below. In other words, a God that dominates everything, one God, right, that controls everything. And this is, of course, far reaching from a theological perspective. Indeed, that description of God in heaven and on earth below appears several times in the Torah. And amongst other places, it appears in the Ten Commandments, um, in the book of Exodus, for example. Show it in the text. Take a look in the prohibition of making idols. You shall not have the gods of others in my presence. You shall not make for yourself a graven image or any likeness which is in the heavens above, which is on the earth below, which is in the water beneath the earth. As we have that combination, nothing in the heavens above nor in the earth below. So that's in the prohibition of making graven images. And similarly, within a positive formulation, and once again in the book of Deuteronomy, and we can see that there are a lot of parallels in language. So in Deuteronomy chapter 4 states, and you shall know this day and consider it in your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth below. There is none else. So in other words, what Rahab is saying basically echoes the commandments, right? Whether it be in the Ten Commandments or also the statement of faith that there is one God who controls everything, found in Deuteronomy chapter 4. So we will return to our chapter. After that profession of faith, we begin to understand what's behind Rahab's very surprising behavior. She professes faith, right, that God will give the Israelites the land, and she professes that the God of Israel is the real God of heaven and earth. But she's not done. She continues speaking. And now I pray, swear to me by the Lord, since I have showed you kindness, that you will also show kindness to my father's house and give me a true token. What does she want? And you shall preserve alive my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and all that they have, and you shall deliver our lives from death. So basically, she's requesting kind of a retribution, payment for what she's done. I mean, she's put her life on the line, and in return, what she wants is to save not only her life, but her whole extended family's life, parents, brothers, and sisters. Now, of course, this is a problematic proposal, right? Rahab is trying to take advantage of the situation, and we can understand her, to save her family. But we know it's problematic because there are specific commandments against, right, making covenants with the dwellers in the land, right? That's stated in as well in the Torah, right? It's a new share here. It says as follows. This is in Deuteronomy again. Notice, right? We spoke about the connection between Joshua and the book of Deuteronomy. So here we have another parallel, but this time we have some tension, because note what it says. When the Lord your God brings you into the land to which you are coming to possess, he will cast away many nations from before you. And then there's a list of all these nations. 7 nations more numerous and powerful than you. and the Lord your God will deliver them to you, and you shall smite them, you shall utterly destroy them, neither shall you make a covenant with them, nor be gracious to them. You shall not intermarry with them, you shall not give your daughter to his son, etc. In other words, there's a specific prohibition on making a covenant and letting and keeping them alive. You have to destroy them. And here, what Rahab is asking is to be saved, and not only herself, but rather her extended family. Is this a possibility which would be acceptable in God's eyes, or does that go against the explicit commandment of making a covenant and an agreement with the dwellers of the land? Well, let's see how our spies will react. And the men answered her, our life for yours. If you will not tell this, our discussion, our words. And it shall be, when the Lord gives us the land, that we will deal with you with kindness and truth. In other words, it seems like they agree, right, to her request, and they say in a language of an oath, our life for yours, nafsheinu tachtechem, like putting their lives on the line, and say, if on one condition, if you don't reveal what we've said, if you won't tell everything, then when the Lord gives us the land, they promise to deal with her kindness and truth. In other words, it seems like they agree to her request, which of course raises a question: is that acceptable in God's eyes, right? To make an agreement. On the flip side, it doesn't seem like they have much of a choice, right? Because, I mean, if they would disagree, their lives would probably be at stake here, because she perhaps would not harbor them, would not hide them, and so therefore they really don't have much of a choice. Now let's remember there's still a problem here. How do they escape? Because the city's gates were locked at night. So the story continues. And she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was in the town wall, and she dwelt in the wall. So for those who are familiar with the archaeology of ancient cities, sometimes we had a double wall encasement, which strengthened the wall, strengthened the power and security of the wall, the fortress. And very often, sometimes between the two walls, the double wall, also there were homes. And apparently this is what we're talking about, that Rahab lived in the wall between those two surrounding walls of Jericho. So the gate is closed. You can't go out through the gate, but she let them down by a rope, basically going down the external walls of the city. And now that Rahab continues to basically direct everything, because she doesn't only let them go, but she instructs them where to go. And she said to them, go to the mountain. That would be go to the west. In other words, east would be the Jordan Valley, the big Jordan Valley. To the west are the mountains of Judea. So she says to them, go the opposite direction, go to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Don't forget, she sent the soldiers to pursue and give chase. And which direction would they chase? Obviously to the east, in the direction that they would expect the spies to return and report. So now she tells the spies, when you leave, go the opposite direction, go to the west, inland. Go to the mountain lest the pursuers meet you, and hide yourselves there 3 days until the pursuers return. And afterwards, you will go your way. So she basically instructs them, right, how to stay safe, even when she lets them go. Now that the men apparently are on their way free, Now they speak at their own initiative. And the men said to her, we will be blameless of this your oath which you made us swear. Behold, when we come into the land, you shall bind this cord of scarlet thread, this red scarlet thread, in the window by which you let us down. And you shall bring your father and your mother and your brothers and all your father's household home to you. And it shall be that whoever shall go out of the doors of your house outside, his blood shall be upon his head. In other words, he'll be responsible for himself. We will not be to blame, and we will be blameless. And that whoever shall be with you in the house, his blood shall be upon our head, if any hand be upon him. And if you tell this our discussion, then we will be blameless of your oath, which you have made us swear. So now the tables seem to turn, because once the spies are home free, right, having been let out of the window, apparently this is a discussion that's happening maybe when they're outside the walls, right? So now it is the spies who are no longer kind of dependent upon Rahab. And therefore, they add some conditions, and those conditions are basically two. One, we agree to promise the safety of your family, but that's on condition that they remain in their house and your house be signaled with this scarlet cord. And of course, they repeat that condition that you keep secret, you don't reveal our whereabouts. So now in this latter conversation, the spies now take initiative and add certain conditions, right? We can understand those conditions because they don't want to limit the warfare. So they want to say, we're ready to leave one house as a harbor of safety, but your family has to be in that house and they can't go out. How does Rahab respond? And she said, according to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed, and she bound the scarlet line or cord in the window. So right away, she does as they said, and signaled her house with that scarlet cord. So basically, the spies agreed to the conditions of Rahab and agreed to make a covenant, right, to save the family of Rahab. How does this correlate with the command not to make a covenant? Is that acceptable? So one can answer, well, they had no choice here. I mean, she had them cornered. They were totally dependent upon her. And hence, you can't really blame them. But I think if we analyze the chapter, I think the gist and the direction of this chapter is that the spies are not only not to blame, but they did the right thing. This is to be expected. And of course, it's to be expected because Rahab put her life on the line, right, to save them. And therefore, they definitely have to save her at least, if not her family. But it seems like the text goes out of its way to justify this action, because it does not only describe the courageous actions of Rahab in saving the spies, putting her life on the line and saving the spies, and describing her shrewdness and quick-wittedness and knowing how to respond to the soldiers and knowing how to hide the spies and also directing the spies in order to remain safe. But it also puts in her mouth that great profession of faith, that one, she understands that the land, even though she, as a Canaanite resident, she understands that this land belongs to the Israelites. In other words, the major problem with the dwellers of the land is, of course, the conflict over the land. But she, even though she's a dweller of the land, she recognizes that it will be given to the Israelites. But even furthermore, she recognizes religiously that the Israelite God is the real God, the God of heaven and the God of earth. And as such, it seems like the text wants to imply that she is deserving to be saved because she is indeed one who has faith in God, right? Her proclamation of faith is very much in tandem with the faith of the Israelites and what the Torah basically obliges us to believe. And hence, it would seem that the text wants to justify the fact that the spies agreed to save not only Rahab, but also her family. And I want to even go a step further and offer perhaps a novel explanation buttressing my claim that the text supports the fact that the spies agreed to save Rahab and her family. Note the conditions that were given when the spies already were on pretty much safe territory and were no longer in the clutch of Rahab. They added the condition that her family remain in the house and that house be signaled by a scarlet cord. Now, do these conditions remind us of anything? The requirement to remain in the house in order to stay out of danger, and the house being signaled out by a red symbol. What pops into my mind is what happens when the Israelites leave on the eve of their departure, the exodus from Egypt. Remember that night before they left, the night of the 10th plague, the Israelites were commanded what's called keeping Passover in Egypt. And in that commandment, once again, in the book of Exodus, we're talking about in the book of Exodus in chapter 12. So there is that commandment. Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, draw forth or buy for yourselves sheep for your families and slaughter the Passover sacrifice. And as they sacrificed those sheep, what were they supposed to do? And you shall take a bunch of hyssop branches of a certain shrub tree, and immerse it in the blood that is in the basin of the lamb that you sacrificed, and you shall extend to the lintel and to the two doorposts the blood that is in the basin. In other words, you have to basically smear the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the entrance to the house, that the blood will be smeared, and you shall not go out, any man from the entrance of his house until morning. The Lord will pass to smite the Egyptians, and he will see the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, and the Lord will pass over the entrance, hence the name Passover. And he will not permit the destroyer to enter your house to smite you. That's, of course, the plague of the firstborn. Now, let's compare. In Egypt, the Israelites, in order to leave Egypt, in order to identify as Israelites and be worthy of being saved, they had to remain in their house, and their house was signaled by blood, red blood on the doorpost, on the lintel. Now let's compare it to the conditions set for Rahab. She too had to remain with her family in the house, not leave, and her house as well was signaled with a red sign, right? That striking color, the red. What I want to propose here is that there's an analogy. And that analogy basically compares what the Israelites had to do in order to save themselves from the plagues in Egypt and what Rahab has to do in order to save herself from the destruction that is about to come upon her neighbors in the city of Jericho. And in both instances, the salvation will come via separation from the surrounding people, right? And perhaps what this symbolizes is that Rahab is separating herself from the Canaanites, from the people of Jericho, and hence may be undergoing the exact same process that the Israelites did in Egypt. And if you will, maybe this is somewhat of a parallel conversion process, symbolizing Rahab's separation from the Canaanites and entrance into the people of Israel. And hence, she will be accepted amongst the people, not necessarily as a Jew, but to dwell amongst the people, right? Because she separated herself from the Canaanites. She was the one who was shrewd enough to understand, right, in light of the events that she became aware of, the historical events of the Exodus and the destruction of the Eastern kings. She was smart enough to understand that the Israelite God is the real God and changed her beliefs. And he was even willing to pay the price and risk her life in order to help the spies. And hence she is found to be worthy of being saved and spared and to join. In other words, I think this story is also justifying, right, the outcome of taking an oath to save Rahab and her family. We'll go back to our story. So the final verse, and they went and came to the mountain and stayed there 3 days until the pursuers returned. Once again, we see the intelligence of Rahab. She knew how long it would take. They would keep on giving chase for several days. And this, of course, connects to 3 days with what was commanded to Joshua to prepare for another 3 days to depart and cross Jordan. And the pursuers sought them throughout all the way, but they did not find them. So the pursuers, of course, were not able to find the spies, and now the spies are capable of going eastward. And the 2 men returned and descended from the mountain and crossed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun, closing with the beginning. Joshua the son of Nun is the one who sent them, and told him all that had happened to them. The Hebrew is Vayisapru et kol hamotzot otam, all that found them, all that had happened to him. From the Shoresh Matzah, we here have a play on words because the soldiers, the Jericho soldiers, did not find, right, lo matzau, they did not find the spies, and then the spies recount what found them, right, namely all the events that transpired. We maybe have a play on words on that same root, matzah, find, right? So they recount, Joshua, what had happened. And let's see what they recount. And they said to Joshua, for the Lord has delivered into our hands all the land, and also the inhabitants of the country have melted away. Notice that same wording, melted away because of us. So they basically quote what Rahab told them, right? That fear has stricken the hearts of all the inhabitants of the land, and basically the Lord has delivered the enemy into our hands. They have no spirits to fight us. Okay, so story is done. The 2 spies return and report only to Joshua. Was the mission successful? So most people would say, sure, look, they came out and they gave the report. However, I would say not so at all. I mean, how do you measure success of a spy? First of all, by his remaining undercover. These spies were, I guess, pretty schlemazel. They were immediately detected, right? And because of that, were they able to really gather a lot of tactical intelligence? Where are the weak points? From what side to attack the city? How many soldiers? How much information were they able to gather? I suspect very little. All they could tell him is, oh, God has delivered into our hands all the land. They start giving this religious speech to Joshua oh, you should have faith in God. God has delivered, and all the inhabitants are scared. Well, they gave some report about the morale of the inhabitants, but they don't really give a lot of, useful military intelligence here, besides the report on the morale of those dwelling there, which has some importance, but definitely I don't think would be sufficient as a spy report. So if you'd ask me, I think these spies were not very successful. I don't think, gathered a lot of useful military intelligence. And perhaps that is part of the message. Joshua did the natural thing and said, okay, we're preparing for attacking and conquest, so we have to gather military intelligence. And that is what is expected in preparation. But perhaps the failure of the spies is meant to inform us that ultimately this spy mission was quite superfluous, because God has other plans for the conquest of the city. Those plans, of course, are not yet known to Joshua. So Joshua was in his right, and even to be expected, in trying to gather intelligence. But ultimately, this spy mission was not very necessary, as we will find out later, because this story, of course, sets the stage for the future story of the conquest of Jericho. So, what does this dramatic story tell us? On the one hand, it definitely informs us of the lack of morale and the trepidation of those dwelling in Canaan. We can see the great, fame of God, of Israel, which was gained via the miracles that were performed both in the Exodus and in the initial conquests to the east. So that is one thing that we definitely learn here, and it strengthens our faith in God, just like I'm sure it strengthened Joshua's faith in God. However, I don't think that that would be the whole gist of the chapter, because it would seem, if we would ask who's the main character in this chapter, it's without a doubt Rahab. And indeed, many scholars have assumed that this story has an etiological motive, namely, it's meant to explain the reality of the descendants of Rahab, who dwelt amongst the Israelites. And so this story was meant to explain how this occurred, that there was this people that remained on close terms with the Israelites and continued living amongst them. So this could be the case, but I think that ultimately the main gist and purpose of this chapter is to highlight Rahab's character, right? And her great faith and her belief in God. And of course, this also sheds light on what we expect from the Israelites, because if one of the Canaanites, and who, this prostitute from the city of Jericho, apparently the lowest of the low, right? A lowly prostitute in the city of Jericho. She is the one who's discovered, right, the true God. So all the more so would we expect from the Israelites themselves. And ultimately, this chapter is meant to explain why she is deserving to be saved, right? Because if one acknowledges that this land is going to be given to the Israelites, and acknowledges that it is the Lord's prerogative to do so, and the Lord of Israel, is the Lord of all of the world and all of the peoples of the heaven and the earth, then this makes Rahab one who is worthy to be saved, right, and not suffer the fate of the rest of the Canaanites. They could have had the same insights, they could have had the same reaction, but they didn't. Rahab did. In fact, even though this is not explicitly written in the text in any way, nor even hinted, there's a very surprising statement by the sages in relation to Rahab. They propose that Rahab married an Israelite. And you know whom that Israelite was? Well, the sages propose that it was none other than Joshua himself, the great believer in God. How would the sages propose such a, we would say, shocking proposal? Joshua is going to marry a harlot, a Canaanite harlot from Jericho. I think, even though I wouldn't take it as a historical idea, right? But I think the message behind it is an appreciation of the greatness of Rahab, a woman who showed such shrewdness and courage and wisdom and capacity to act quickly and so intelligently, reading the reality, right, knowing how to respond, right, and professing such great faith, right. What the sages wanted to say is that Rahab, such a character, she would be worthy of marrying Joshua. I want to conclude with a return to the mention of Shittim, which we began. That's where the spies return, right, to report to Joshua, right? And we said that Shittim was the location where the Israelites sinned, a sexual sin with the daughters of Moab that eventually led to idolatry. And in our story, once again, Shittim appears and a harlot appears, and there are many linguistic words carrying sexual connotations. They came, right? She came up to them. All these words, vayavo, right? Vayishkevu sham, and they laid there. The usage of these verbs seems very odd, especially in the context of the mention of a harlot. Now, what is the text trying to say here, right? Why use these words? There are some scholars who suggested that the spies used the services of Rahab, right? And I guess would blame them for improprietous conduct. I don't think that's the case at all, right? But I will admit that there are many words that seem to have, sexual innuendo within them. And the question is why? And I want to follow here Professor Assis's proposal that this is purposefully done in order to place this story as a corrective measure to the original sin of the Israelites in Shittim, right? This is to remedy that original sin, because the Israelites failed with the daughters of Moab when they were in Shittim and had sexual misconduct, which led to religious, right, idolatry. And this story is perhaps meant to be a rectification of that. Once again, Shittim is repeated, and there is everything that allows for, once again, sexual mispropriety and misconduct. Spies in a foreign city, in a house, in a brothel, in a house of the harlot, and with all the potential and added hints via the language, I think it is clear that nothing happened, if you will, and hence this may also be a rectification. The spies were people, believing people, people who did not have misconduct, but rather were faithful to the God of Israel and were faithful to their mission, even though they weren't successful in it. And it is not that the foreign woman caused the Israelites to sin, but to the contrary. And very ironically, in this story, it is that great character Rahab, who's the lowest of the lowest, harlot in the city, in this sinful city of Jericho, was one to discover and to reveal the true God, and eventually is found worthy to be saved and separated from the rest of the people of that city. And like we said, the sages even took it a step further by saying that she married Joshua. And in my mind, that's just to highlight the tremendous appreciation for that courageous and very wise and shrewd woman, Rahab, the harlot from the city of Jericho.